Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Welcome back for another episode of Legal Tea. Today's topic is a current trend, something going on in the current time that is pertinent to my little estate and elder law world. Today's topic is not actually going on currently, but I stumbled upon it recently thanks to a team member of mine at the office who called my attention to a documentary released on Netflix on Bob Ross. You know, the guy that famously painted for a living on TV. He always painted pieces on pieces on nature, with trees and cabins and mountains, all that sort of thing. He was known for his permed hair too, and even today you can get a little chia pet with this face and hair. The documentary is perfectly titled too. It's called Happy Accidents, Betrayal Greed. One of the things you used to always hear him say was, "We don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents." You know, thinking like that, I think Bob and I should have been friends. I am a glass half full kind of gal myself, Bob. By the way, if you do care to check it out, there is a direct link to the Netflix page for the documentary in the episode source links for this episode. The documentary starts off by introducing us to Bob's son, Steve, and Steve starts by sharing about his mother, Vivian, also known as and most often referred to as Vicky. And her and Bob were married for a handful of years. According to Bob Ross's Wikipedia page, Bob and Vicky were married from 1965 until 1977 when they got divorced. Actually, within that same year of the divorce, 1977, Bob actually got remarried and her name was Jane. And Bob and Jane maintained their marriage for a good long time until Jane's passing, which we'll get to in a little bit. After introducing us to Steve, the documentary introduces us to a fellow artist and dear friend of Bob named John Tham. They met when Bob took a painting class from John, actually, and John shared that Bob was actually inspired by an artist by the name of William Alexander. Bob once said on his show that, quote, "It almost made me angry the first time I saw William Alexander, on TV, that he could, in a matter of minutes, do what it took me days to do." Bob and William's worlds collided, and soon after, Bob, after retiring from the military, began teaching how to paint alongside Alexander. It was there that Bob met a lady by the name of Annette Kowalski when she attended one of those painting classes. Annette, after recently losing her son, sort of latched on to painting as a grieving device, and as a byproduct of that, she latched on to Bob, and her husband, Walt Kowalski, actually attended several of Bob's classes. According to a Daily Beast article, Annette shared to NPR one time that she was, quote, "so mesmerized by Bob. Somehow he lifted me up out of that depression. I just think Bob knew how to woo people. I said, let's put it in a bottle and sell it," end quote. Shortly after the documentary introduced us to the Kowalskis, a caption took over the screen, and it said, quote, "More than a dozen people who knew and worked with Bob declined to participate in this film due to concerns of legal retaliation," end quote. It was clear that they were concerned about legal retaliation by the Kowalskis, which we'll get to also in a little bit. Fast forward some time later, Bob started painting on a show called The Joy of Painting, which, according to the Wikipedia on Bob Ross, was actually filmed at a PBS studio in Muncie, Indiana. How's that for a nice little Indiana shout out for us Hoosiers? Anyway, after the show started, his painting classes and workshops got full, like really, really full. In between the classes and the workshops and the show, Bob sure made a name for himself, and he became sort of like a household name. Many people knew and recognized the name Bob Ross at this point. That guy that paints on TV. The documentary goes on to share that Bob, quote, did his thing. He painted and connected with people, and the Kowalskis took care of the business aspect. For example, a product line was actually started in Bob's name, things like paint and brushes, etc. And the documentary actually stated that an argument broke out between Bob and the Kowalskis because Bob had really high expectations of his products, quality was important to him, while the Kowalskis were more money-focused rather than quality-focused. Things continued as they were for a while, and remember me sharing about Bob's wife, Jane? Well, unfortunately, in 1992, Jane passed away from cancer. And because the way the partnership for Bob Ross Incorporated was set up, according to the Daily Beast article, Jane's stock or Jane's shares in the company were divided equally amongst the surviving owners. So Bob, Annette, and Walt. And in retrospect, I wonder if that was perhaps an oversight by Bob and Jane, because one would think that Jane's shares would go to Bob only, making Bob the majority shareholder at that point. Instead, the Kowalskis together were the majority shareholders, since they now owned 2/3 and Bob owned 1/3. Just 2 to 3 weeks after Jane passed away, Bob was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And once diagnosed, Bob dramatically and rapidly declined. So much so that at one point, Bob was actually staying at the Kowalski's house. And I'm not sure if it was because of his poor health or what, but he was essentially living there. One time, Steve, his son, came over to the Kowalskis to visit his dad, Bob, and while he was there, Steve shared that Annette approached him about having Bob sign a, quote, memorial agreement. Steve shared on the documentary that Annette explained that it was a memorial to be built for Bob, but Steve thought it looked more like she was trying to get Bob to sign over his name and likeness, his kind of intellectual property, over to them. Steve refused to help Annette get that signed, and Steve claimed that Annette was furious. Steve further shared that at one point he actually overheard his dad scream, quote, "I'm not giving you my name," end quote. And that Bob shared with a friend that he thought that the Kowalskis were, quote, trying to steal his name while on his deathbed, end quote. Not long after these tense moments and conversations, Bob passed away at the age of 52 on July 4th, 1995. Steve shared in the documentary that the Kowalskis did not come to the funeral, and that in fact the Kowalskis were trying to keep Bob's passing quiet. Surprisingly, according to Steve, only about 30 to 40 people attended Bob Ross's funeral. According to an article titled "The Surprisingly Mysterious Life of Famed Artist Bob Ross" by Carl Smallwood, Bob actually didn't disclose his cancer diagnosis. Really only his close family and friends knew. That breaks my heart. It so breaks my heart. But that also could have contributed to the low numbers at the funeral. Several years later, Steve, in an attempt to figure out if he had the rights to use his father's name, he started digging through paperwork. It was in that digging that he found Bob's estate plan. This is several years later. And according to the Daily Beast article, Bob had, prior to his passing, made several last-minute changes to his last will and testament, specifically adding that his, quote, name, likeness, and the rest of his intellectual property, end quote, were to go to Steve and one of Bob's half-brothers, Jimmy. So Bob and Jimmy. Or excuse me, Steve and Jimmy. It was supposed to all go to Steve and Jimmy. Sadly, Steve learned about these changes much too late. Jimmy, the half-brother, was actually the executor of Bob's estate and had not shared the details of all of this with Steve. With the partnership agreement governing the business at this point, the Kowalskis had total control of Bob Ross Inc. But without Bob Ross, and without being awarded Bob's name and likeness from Bob, the Kowalskis began suing people much like Oprah gives out cars on Christmas. You get a lawsuit, you get a lawsuit, and you get a lawsuit. What they were attempting to do was grab and gain Bob's name and likeness by, as described in the Daily Beast article, by brute legal force. In effort to not make this episode all about all the legal battles between the Kowalskis, Bob Ross Inc., Bob's estate, Bob's heirs, and even like the Kowalskis even sued a random Indiana dermatologist who I believe was a producer for a TV show. And they were pretty ruthless. At the very, very end of the legal battles, Jimmy, the half-brother, signed a settlement agreement on behalf of Bob's estate with the Kowalskis. And this occurred nearly 2 years after Bob died. Full disclosure here, Jimmy was not part of the documentary at all. So we didn't hear from him. We didn't get to hear his side. But the documentary stated in a caption that Jimmy was not interviewed for the documentary because of, quote, fear of being sued by the Kowalskis. So what's going on today, like nowadays? Well, the OG Kowalskis, the original Kowalskis, Annette and Walt, turned over Bob Ross Inc. to their daughter, Joan Kowalski, in 2012. And that was according to that Daily Beast article. The documentary shared that Bob Ross Inc. today continues to be operated by the Kowalski family, and it profits millions of dollars every year from the licensing. And sort of a mic drop moment at the end of the documentary, it shared that Steve had not received any of those profits, which makes sense given the legal battles and where things ended up. So, shooey, what a wild ride, a wild story. Prior to the documentary's release, and honestly my team member even mentioning that I needed to check it out for this podcast, I had totally not heard of the drama that ensued while Bob was living and after he passed away regarding his estate. I truly feel like I could probably write a whole separate episode on what we can learn from Bob, but to keep things brief, I'll leave you with these couple nuggets. First, I have to wonder if an attorney was involved at all in drafting and executing that partnership agreement for Bob Ross Inc. Honestly, the amount of agreements that I see for like my clients' businesses that are thrown together is scary. I hope that wasn't the case here. Heck, things may have not gotten so messy. If Jane's shares would have gone to Bob, and Bob's shares would have gone to his estate, maybe Bob's intent would have been carried out. Second, communication is key. And I relate this back in 2 notes. So first, of course, as you navigate running a business, make sure things are communicated between the partners, between the owners well, and that things that should be in writing are in writing, which is kind of what I was mentioning in that first nugget. Secondly, communication is also key between an executor and the estate's beneficiaries. I'm still so stumped by Jimmy settling with the Kowalskis, Jimmy as the executor of Bob's estate, settling with the Kowalskis without Steve's knowledge and input. So take them or leave them. Next week's topic, we're back to estate planning of the rich and famous. And then we're going to be talking about yet another great musician. We've done Michael Jackson in the past, we've done Prince in the past, and next week we're going to be talking about Aretha Franklin. So yeah, we'll talk about her and her estate next Tuesday, Legal Tea listeners. Talk to you then and stay well.